Hello friends, this is Jaime and I'm kind of your resident library specialist who's going to show you some art projects today. And I work for the MidPointe library system, and we're going to do more of a paint with tape project. You may have seen something like this on Pinterest before. It was really popular to put tape down on a canvas and then paint over top of it and pull the tape off. But we're going to do something a little different this time. And these are two complete projects where I did more warm colors at the background versus kind of more cool colors. And then had created some really interesting, almost maze-like pattern by taping down and what's called masking. So I would mask certain areas off with the tape and then paint it again. I chose to do just white this time, but black looks really cool and almost kind of stained glass-like. And that's why I personally like this type of project better, because once you would lift up the tape on the canvas, what's kind of disappointing is it leaves this white space, and I am all for color. If we can add more color, let's do that. So these are on just watercolor paper because you definitely want something a little more dense because you're going to be using acrylic paint. And you can use like the apple barrel paint. That's usually about 50 or 60 cents at Walmart or Michael's. It's thinner consistency than the paint I'm using today because this paint is more of like the tube paint. But what's awesome is Dollar Tree has tube paint, and this is actually a Walmart brand. They also have these, and it's thicker, so there's more coverage. But definitely experiment with that, because if you already have the craft paint, you might as well use it. And what I'm going to do today then, say you don't have any kind of watercolor paper, you probably have some sort of box that you might be almost finished with or already putting in the recycling. This is part of a movie theater popcorn box that I just cut along its edges where it bent. So this makes a great start to your piece. So we'll take those finished pieces off. And with this, I already picked some colors that I wanted to use. It almost looks like the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black colors that you would use on a printer. But these are really great paints to use. And all we start with, excuse me, is to kind of get your brush a little wet and just grab maybe like your lightest color. Ignore the black and the white for now. Just use some straight color. And you'll be creating some kind of pattern or maybe just streaking paint on, especially if you're not real familiar. No, you'll just be covering this entire piece. Try not to add too much paint, but you'll just have to think of some drying time. And I'm going to do more blobs. And you'll notice with this, since it's not white, it is going to color your background, your paint. So you can actually paint this entire thing white to start with. But I kind of want the brown to show through. And you can always just do some random strokes and try to get more of the paint off of your brush. And I'm just using a fairly large brush that's kind of a square. Since I'm doing some large brush strokes, something like this is probably a little too small. But if you wanted to do small details, that's fine. But I just want to get it kind of in random places. Wash out your brush in between changing colors. You don't have to, but I prefer to try to keep these as pristine as possible. And just go back over top of some of the yellow with the pink. And I always feel that random pattern works really well. When you get really defined patterns, though, I have had people do straight lines completely across with different colors. Usually I would keep about anywhere from 3 to 5 colors, but if you have something already in mind and you want to use more, do it. You do not have to do exactly what I'm doing. I encourage experimentation. And this is a way, too, to really get familiar with how your brush and your paint works. Like, I love dry brushing because it gets that real fun edge, and you can completely go over the yellow and kind of get some cool brush strokes. And grabbing some of the blue. And when the blue crosses over the yellow, it's going to have more of a greenish tint. And when it goes over the pink, it's going to be more purpley. So this is another example of like color mixing, like kind of finding out how your colors interact with each other. And you can really keep it this simple. It doesn't have to be super, let's face it, we're not trying to make a Van Gogh here, but we're trying to have some fun and experimenting with what you have. And I like trying to mix up the colors and putting them in different places because it helps the eye move around, because especially since we're going to cover up certain spaces, because this will eventually be covered in black lines after we lay tape down. So say that we'll keep this the way it is, because I do actually really like the way that looks right now. But if you did want to bring in more yellow, even though we've already used the lighter color, it's okay to kind of go back over top, because then you'll get more mix happening. Because sometimes as you paint some of this stuff, it does dry pretty quickly, and you may not get as much mixing as you want. Also looks very 80s right now, doesn't it? So just as long as you get the whole thing covered, that's the important part. You've already created your background. And then our next move is to use tape. I really like using removable tape by Scotch. It can be a little hard to find though, and you may have something more like painter's tape. And painter's tape is low tack, but depending on, like, if you use watercolor paper, this may still be a little too tacky. So anytime you use this or masking tape, or even, I would probably stay away from Scotch tape, where it's the stuff you would put on Christmas packages. I'd rather use something like this. Just because it can really stick and tear your piece as you pull it up. But even with this, I would recommend kind of getting it less tacky by either kind of sticking it on your skin or on your clothing to make it less tacky. You want it tacky enough that it will stay down and prevent your paint from going under it. But from here, you would grab your tape, whichever you have, and start laying down shapes. So wherever this is going, you're saving and masking off that area that you lay it down in. So whatever you lay this on, it will show up when we pull it off. Now, if you want it gone, don't lay your tape there. Because I know it sounds hard or kind of weird, but you are laying pieces of tape down to create straight edges or kind of a pattern over top. So right there, I'm just going to, in fact, I'm going to lift that up because it doesn't go all the way off. I'm just going to make it go off the edge so I have this nice straight edge on each side. I'm going to do another piece. And just think, the closer you get, the line of black paint is going to be thinner. So each piece of tape, and you can even cut this up with scissors to do different shapes, or to thin your tape. But the further you lay your tape parallel to another piece of tape, this whole piece is going to become black. So if you're okay with really thick black lines, you're good to go. But I really like to kind of grab tinier pieces and start creating kind of a fun pattern. Because straight lines are fun and all, but you may want to do a little bit of different shapes. And remember, if you keep that kind of ragged edge to your tape, it will show up too. So just keep that in mind. And you can always cut your pieces of tape. But you see how far apart this is? That's going to all get paint. So you won't see this background once we paint over top of it. And I do want some different shapes happening. So this is where you can kind of cut your tape and maybe do like triangles are pretty easy to do. Place that in that space. So this is masking that off. So this will be able to lift up and reveal the background underneath. So you would eventually do all over this. And the removable tape you can see on this separate piece that's on white watercolor paper, that you can barely make out that there's tape on there. But if you prefer the removable tape, you can see what you're masking off. And then once you paint black over top of it, you'll be able to pull that tape off and see what you see through this tape. But let's go ahead. Since this is pretty dry, I'm going to keep continuing on this one. And I'm going to, since I have some of this really cut, we'll just keep doing some fun shapes. Grab a little bit more. Do more triangle type shapes in that corner. I've had some people even do like their letters of their name and then do stripes around it. That really looked really neat. But I've also had people where they've almost covered the entire thing with tape, and that is sort of not very good because you end up really painting hardly any of it with the black paint. And like I said before, you could do white lines, but I really like the black. That's probably one of the few times I like using black paint. So pretend that I have this whole thing covered and I'll show you what some of the black paint will start looking like on here. And you can definitely just kind of do one area and paint it to see how it's going to look. Because maybe you'll end up seeing that you don't have enough. And you can always retape it after it dries and redo the black lines. and do a whole set. But depending on the kind of paint you use, you might notice it goes down kind of thinly at first. Don't fret, don't worry about that. You'll probably have to do 2 or 3 coats depending on the type of paint you use. But just think of it as this is like the lead holding onto pieces of glass in a stained glass piece. And we'll definitely paint this corner so you can see. And you want this paint to dry pretty well before you lift. I'm going to kind of push or rush the process a little so you can see what it would look like, but I'm trying to do a couple of layers as I go, so it may look a little more wet than normal, because you do want this paint to be fairly dry before you try to lift any tape so that it doesn't streak your paint everywhere. Because let's face it, we don't want to wear most of our paint, though it happens. So if you are one of those people, you might want to wear an apron or at least some old clothing. And no problem with that. I have some artist friends who do pretty much wear outfits that are covered in paint all the time. And sometimes I think it actually looks kind of cool. It just may not work for the office. But you just keep going. So obviously here, this area is pretty big, so it is going to be a good sized chunk of black. So if you are worried about that happening, just keep breaking that up. It doesn't have to be a huge spot of black, because it will cover up more of that background. And we'll give this a chance to kind of dry a little bit, and I'll show you my other piece that I showed you a second ago that had the removable tape on it. Don't forget to try to wash your brush in between. Don't let your paintbrush sit in the water. It's actually really hard on the bristles, so you want to clean it out as much as you can. Wipe it out on the paper towel until you see no color coming out of it, and just let it sit on your tabletop. It will help it out a lot, especially if you tend to get cheaper brushes. You will lengthen the life of your brush. So, like this one was just sort of a fun circular background with green, yellow, and blue, and then you can see where I had already started laying some tape down and painting with the black. So once it's dry, you can pull off the tape and you'll see what's left underneath. And it does, what's really cool about the tape is it does create some really strong straight lines for you. And I have quite a bit of tape put down, so that's why this is not all coming off. But I've had some people realize that they did not pick up all the tape yet. So you might want to kind of feel around on your piece of paper to make sure you got it all, if you are using something like this where you can see through it. But it creates some really cool lines. And this is another one where it was black, and this is where the paint or the tape was. And then I also did some of the white, and this is where the tape was. But now here's the white. The white will definitely need quite a few layers if you choose to use white. White will be the most effective if you have really dark colors laid down for your background, but when they're pretty light, it's hard to show the contrast. It will have very minimal contrast. So with this one, since we've got some dryness, and like I said, I'm kind of rushing this, but I wanted you to see what it looks like when you start pulling the tape off. And each time it's going to be kind of different for you, because it is hard to figure out exactly what it's going to look like, because you are covering areas that may have a brighter color that you forgot about. But it creates these really great lines with the tape, cool shapes, and you can really have fun with it. Excuse me, getting coffee again. So just continue with doing this kind of thing, like pulling up your tape. You'll end up really loving the effects. I encourage you to do more and more, especially if you have quite a few boxes. You can use up and do some really cool pieces by recycling some of the cardboard you have at your house. And it just creates something cool and abstract, and something that you don't have to feel like has to look like an apple or look like anything, really. But please experiment. Please try out something like this. I think you'll have a blast. And thank you so much for spending the time with me and watching me create something with you. I really hope you have an awesome, creative day that is full of surprises like this, and that you come and stop by the MidPointe Library System and say hello. I'll be at probably any branch, but my name's Jaime, and you have an awesome day. Thank you. Bye.